Charlie Kirk's accused killer may face the death penalty. And here's the twist that has stunned the country. His widow doesn't want it. After the shocking assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk at Utah Valley University, prosecutors wasted no time announcing their intent to seek the death penalty for 22-year-old suspect Tyler James Robinson. Even Utah's governor voiced his support, saying that some crimes are so brutal, so damaging to society, that execution is the only fitting punishment. But Erika Kirk, Charlie's wife, stood before cameras, and instead of calling for vengeance, she said she forgives her husband's killer. She said she would not personally push for his death. So why is the state moving forward anyway? Why, when the victim's own family has chosen forgiveness, does the government insist that the ultimate punishment must still be on the table? The answer lies in the way America views justice, not as a private matter between families and offenders, but as a public demand by the state itself. Prosecutors argue that Robinson's crime wasn't just against Charlie Kirk, or even against his family. It was a crime against society, against democracy, against the very principle of free political speech. He didn't just kill a man, they say. He tried to silence a political voice in front of children and families, and that, in their eyes, demands nothing less than death. This is where the controversy explodes. Because what happens when mercy collides with law? If Erika Kirk can forgive, should the state not follow her lead? Or is forgiveness a personal choice that cannot erase the demands of justice? Proponents of the death penalty argue that if Robinson escapes with just a life sentence, it sends the wrong message, that politically motivated violence can be forgiven too easily, that anyone can walk into a public event, shoot a speaker they disagree with, and live out their days in prison. They say the death penalty isn't just punishment. It's a deterrent, a warning, a line drawn in blood. But opponents fire back. What greater deterrent is there than a grieving widow standing strong, refusing to seek vengeance? If even the family doesn't want another life taken, who exactly is the state killing for? Justice or politics? And then there's the role of the governor. Utah's leadership has made it clear. They support prosecutors. They want the death penalty pursued. But critics argue that political leaders are using Kirk's death as a stage, that pushing for execution is less about justice and more about scoring political points, proving they're tough on crime in front of a divided nation. Meanwhile, Erika's forgiveness complicates everything. To some, she's a saint, living proof of faith and strength in the face of tragedy. To others, she's naive, even reckless, undermining the state's case with her mercy. But her voice cannot be ignored, because it cuts to the very heart of the question. Whose justice is this really? If justice belongs to the victim's family, then forgiveness should be enough. But if justice belongs to the state, then forgiveness means nothing. The machinery of execution rolls forward, no matter what. And that's where America finds itself today, split between two visions of justice. One vision demands blood for blood, death for death, believing that only execution balances the scales. The other vision demands mercy, forgiveness, and the belief that killing again only deepens the wound. This case forces the question we can't escape. Should a man be executed when the victim's own family forgives him? Or is the government right to say that forgiveness is personal, but justice belongs to the state? Charlie Kirk was not just another political commentator. He was the founder of Turning Point USA, a conservative student organization that rose to national prominence by challenging what he and his followers described as the liberal dominance of America's college campuses. To his supporters, Kirk was a fearless truth-teller, a young man who had the courage to stand up against the cultural tide, preaching capitalism, free speech, and traditional values to a generation they believed was being indoctrinated. To his critics, however, he was something else entirely: a provocateur, a manipulator, and even, in the eyes of some, a dangerous demagogue who thrived on division. Kirk's style was sharp, confrontational, and unapologetically populist. He framed himself as the voice of young conservatives, often sparring with professors, liberal activists, and even mainstream Republicans who he accused of being weak or compromised. He frequently appeared on Fox News, podcasts, and massive social media platforms, creating viral sound bites that made him impossible to ignore. But that visibility came at a cost. While Kirk built a devoted following, especially among college Republicans, religious conservatives, and grassroots activists, he also attracted deep resentment. For many progressives, his politics were more than disagreeable. They were inflammatory. He opposed abortion, criticized LGBTQ+ activism, and took a hardline stance on issues of immigration and race. His detractors claimed he wasn't just promoting conservatism, but weaponizing it in ways that polarized young Americans even further. By the time of his death, Charlie Kirk had become one of the most recognizable conservative voices of his generation. Admirers saw him as a fighter who stood unflinching in the face of hostility, while opponents saw him as someone who thrived on outrage and pushed the country deeper into cultural war. Love him or hate him, Kirk had positioned himself at the very center of America's political battlefield. Charlie Kirk was more than just a political activist. He was a cultural warrior, one who thrived on controversy, sharpened his reputation through outrage, and made his career by saying the things others in his movement were too careful to say. When George Floyd was murdered in 2020, sparking global protests, most public figures offered condolences or called for reform. Kirk did the opposite. He openly dismissed Floyd as a horrible human being and claimed the Black Lives Matter movement was built on a lie. While millions were marching in the streets demanding justice, Kirk was on his podcast telling listeners that the protests weren't about justice at all, but about tearing down America. To supporters, this was raw honesty, a refusal to bow to mob rule. To critics, it was cruelty, racial provocation, and proof that his brand of conservatism thrived on dehumanizing black victims. On guns, Kirk was equally unyielding. He insisted that any attempt at gun control was nothing short of tyranny. He often told students that America's freedoms were guaranteed, not by government, but by the Second Amendment. Even after mass shootings, when emotions ran high, Kirk doubled down, saying tragedies should not be used as excuses to strip law-abiding Americans of their weapons. His framing of the gun debate was absolute: liberty on one side, slavery on the other. Then there was his war against DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. To Kirk, DEI was nothing more than discrimination dressed up in the language of justice. He accused corporations and universities of hiring unqualified people just to check boxes, and he often singled out black women as beneficiaries of what he called woke tokenism. These statements ignited firestorms, with critics blasting him as sexist and racist, while his fans applauded him for saying out loud what many conservatives quietly believed. His takes on sexuality and gender were just as explosive. Kirk regularly mocked LGBTQ+ activism, portraying it as an assault on family values and freedom of religion. He said gay marriage had opened the floodgates to moral decline, and claimed transgender rights were part of a radical agenda to erase truth itself. At college speeches, when confronted by queer students, he rarely softened his stance. Instead, he dug in, framing their existence as evidence of America's cultural collapse. These weren't slip-ups or accidental sound bites. They were deliberate positions. Kirk knew outrage brought attention, and attention brought power. He turned every scandal into fuel, every backlash into proof that he was right. For some Americans, especially young conservatives hungry for a fighter, Charlie Kirk was a hero who said what others were too scared to say. For others, he was a dangerous voice, one that inflamed racial tensions, marginalized minorities, and deepened divisions in a country already on edge. By the time of his assassination, Kirk had become both a symbol of resistance and a target of rage. To understand why his death struck such a raw nerve, you first have to understand the world he built around himself. One where every word, every take, was designed to either inspire or enrage. Tyler did not come from poverty, nor from a broken home that usually fills the headlines in stories like this. He grew up in Washington County, Utah, in a large 6-bedroom house with his parents and 2 younger brothers. His father, Matt Robinson, ran a granite countertop business. His mother, Amber Denise, worked as a social worker, often helping people with disabilities gain access to care. From the outside, this was a stable, middle-class, church-going Republican family, the kind of family that would have applauded much of what Charlie Kirk stood for. Tyler was the quiet one. Teachers described him as intelligent and reserved, the type of student who never caused problems, but never quite fit in either. He played sports casually, kept decent grades, and was known to spend long stretches of time online. In 2021, he briefly enrolled at Utah State University as a pre-engineering student. He lasted only a semester before leaving, later joining an electrical apprenticeship program at Dixie Technical College. On paper, it looked like the path of a young man still searching for direction, not one destined for notoriety. But beneath the surface, things were shifting. Tyler's parents were solidly conservative, registered Republicans who had supported Donald Trump. His grandmother openly described the household as pro-Trump, and most of the family identified with the right. Tyler, however, began moving in the opposite direction. Investigators and family members later said that in the last few years, he had become more outspoken about supporting LGBTQ+ and transgender rights. At family dinners, he would bristle at conservative talking points. In one instance, just days before the shooting, he told his family that Charlie Kirk was full of hate and spreading poison into the culture. Friends and family described Tyler as quiet but politically activated. He wasn't posting wild rants online under anonymous usernames, at least nothing confirmed, but in private, his views were sharpening. He saw Kirk not just as another commentator, but as a symbol of everything he despised. Kirk's dismissive comments about George Floyd, his mocking of DEI programs, his attacks on LGBTQ+ people, all of it clashed with the values Tyler was beginning to embrace. His mother's career may have also played a role. As a social worker serving the disabled, Amber Robinson had spent years in environments where compassion was central. Tyler, close to his mother, likely absorbed her perspective. When Kirk belittled diversity programs or painted marginalized groups as threats, Tyler may have seen it as a direct insult to people like his mother and those she fought to support. Still, what makes this case so disturbing is that there were no flashing warning signs. Tyler had no criminal record. He wasn't known as violent. He wasn't the type of person neighbors feared or teachers flagged. He blended in. But quietly, his resentment toward Kirk was festering. That resentment boiled over when Kirk's fall speaking tour was announced. Utah Valley University in Orem was on the list. For most, it was just another date in a series of campus stops. For Tyler, it was an opportunity. At a family dinner, he mentioned the event and again called Kirk a hateful man. Nobody thought much of it, but prosecutors now say that by then, Tyler was already planning something drastic. On September 10, 2025, he allegedly acted on those plans. Tyler arrived at Utah Valley University with a rifle, legally purchased but illegally modified, and blended in with the crowd of students, parents, and children filing into the auditorium. For Kirk, it was supposed to be another day of questions, speeches, and photo ops. For Tyler, it was the moment where years of pent-up frustration collided with violence. What happened next turned Tyler James Robinson from an unknown young man into the face of a capital murder case that has divided a nation. September 10, 2025, began like any other tour stop for Charlie Kirk. Utah Valley University was buzzing with energy as students lined up outside the auditorium, some eager to hear the firebrand conservative in person, others ready to challenge him during the QA. Parents had brought their teenagers, and a handful of younger children clutched cell phones hoping to grab selfies. To Kirk, this was familiar territory, a crowd he could work, a stage he could own. Inside, the lights were bright, the cameras rolling, the audience restless. Kirk stepped onto the stage to applause and chants. He wasted no time diving into the issues that had made him both beloved and despised. Free speech, political correctness, and the Second Amendment. His voice carried the same confidence that had electrified conservative circles for nearly a decade. Then came the moment that would change everything. Just 20 minutes into his speech, Kirk leaned forward, gripping the podium, and began defending what he often called the sacred American right to own a gun. His tone sharpened as he told the audience that gun control was a slippery slope toward tyranny. Those were the last words he ever spoke. A sharp crack rang out, echoing through the auditorium. At first, some thought it was feedback from the sound system. But then Kirk staggered. Blood blossomed across his chest as the bullet tore through him. Screams erupted. Chairs clattered as people dove for cover. Parents shielded children. Security rushed forward, but the shooter had already melted back into the chaos. Kirk collapsed on stage, his microphone falling with a hollow thud. Witnesses described the scene as surreal. A man who had spoken endlessly about the power of firearms cut down by one in front of hundreds. Within minutes, medics were on the scene, performing chest compressions, while law enforcement locked down the campus. But despite desperate efforts, Charlie Kirk was pronounced dead not long after. The immediate aftermath was confusion and panic. Early reports suggested the shooter had escaped on foot, blending into the crowd of terrified students. Law enforcement swarmed the area, helicopters circling above, roadblocks sealing off exits. Within hours, the FBI joined the hunt, combing through surveillance footage and interviewing witnesses. That night, authorities believed they had their suspect. An older white male was detained near Provo after witnesses thought he matched the description of the gunman. The arrest made headlines instantly. Many thought the case was solved within hours. But by dawn, the FBI announced that the man was not connected. The relief that someone had been caught quickly turned to unease. The real shooter was still out there. The next morning, investigators released a grainy still image pulled from campus security cameras. The photo showed a young man in a hoodie slipping through the crowd, with what appeared to be a rifle concealed under his jacket. Within hours, the name Tyler James Robinson surfaced. The resemblance was unmistakable, and when the image hit national news, his parents saw what the rest of the country now knew. Matt and Amber Robinson faced the unthinkable. Their quiet son, the boy who once tinkered with wires in the garage, the one they thought was still just finding his way, was the face on every screen. By that afternoon, the Robinsons made the call. They turned Tyler in to authorities themselves, driving him to meet federal agents. The manhunt was over less than 36 hours after Kirk's assassination, but the damage was done. America had watched one of its most polarizing conservative voices collapse in real time. And now the young man accused of pulling the trigger was in federal custody, facing charges that could bring the ultimate punishment: death by lethal injection. What began as another fiery campus lecture ended as a national spectacle: a murder, a botched arrest, a frantic manhunt, and parents forced to hand their own son to the FBI. But for many, the larger question still lingered. How could a quiet, intelligent young man from a conservative family end up accused of killing one of the very voices his parents admired? The courtroom is where mercy collides with law. And in the case of Tyler James Robinson, the 22-year-old accused of killing conservative commentator Charlie Kirk, the tension is sharper than ever. Robinson is not just facing a single charge of murder. He is charged with aggravated murder, the most serious homicide charge under Utah law. Alongside it are counts of felony discharge of a firearm, witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and even committing a violent offense in the presence of a child. Each charge builds the picture prosecutors want the jury to see, that this was not a tragic accident, but a deliberate, premeditated act of political violence. Under Utah law, aggravated murder is the only category of homicide that allows for the death penalty, and prosecutors argue that Robinson's crime meets not one, but several aggravating factors. The shooting, they say, was carried out in front of children. It created a great risk of death for people beyond Kirk himself. And most damning of all, investigators allege Robinson targeted Kirk because of his political expression, because he was on stage, defending gun rights, speaking to an audience about the very freedoms Robinson despised. That combination is why Utah County Attorney Jeff Gray filed a formal notice of intent to seek the death penalty. It's a declaration to the court, the defense, and the public. If Robinson is convicted, the state will ask that he pay the ultimate price. But here is where the story twists. Just days after her husband's murder, Erika Kirk stood before cameras, her voice trembling but steady. She said she forgives the man who killed Charlie. She said she would not push for his death. For her, mercy was the only answer. "I will not let hatred consume me," she explained. Her statement made headlines worldwide. Forgiveness in the face of brutal loss. But as powerful as it was, it did not change the course of the case. Because in the eyes of the law, murder is not only a crime against a family, it is a crime against the state, against the community, against the very order of society. And the state of Utah has chosen a path Erika does not support, to seek execution. Prosecutors say they have the evidence to prove their case. Robinson's DNA on the trigger, bullet casings that match his weapon, and messages that reveal his growing hatred for Kirk's words. Witnesses claim he told them he'd had enough of the hatred. To the state, it all shows motive, planning, and intent. The defense will argue otherwise. They'll question the evidence. They'll press the jury to see Robinson's youth, his background, his possible instability, and they'll use Erika Kirk's forgiveness as a plea for mercy. But Utah's law is clear. If the jury finds the aggravating factors proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and if they outweigh the mitigating ones, a death sentence remains on the table. This is the collision of forgiveness and punishment. Erika Kirk may have extended grace, but the state is preparing to exact justice. And if prosecutors succeed, Tyler Robinson may become one of the youngest men in Utah to face death row in decades. And this is where the case rests, in the uneasy space between mercy and law. Erika Kirk's forgiveness is moving, but under Utah Code Paragraph 76-5202, aggravated murder carries the possibility of execution when aggravating factors are present. Prosecutors argue Robinson's act checks those boxes. A killing tied to political expression, committed in front of children, and endangering more than just the intended target. In Utah, that's enough to override a widow's plea for mercy. The law doesn't bend simply because forgiveness is offered. It balances mitigation against aggravation, and when the scales tilt toward aggravation, the death penalty remains firmly on the table. So while Erika Kirk may have spoken grace into a moment of national rage, the state has spoken law. And until Robinson is formally tried in court, he stands in the shadow of Utah's most severe punishment. Mercy may belong to the heart, but justice, in this case, belongs to the state.